So now that we have a general understanding of what meditation is and enlightenment, we need to talk a little bit more about the history of meditation, because I think that knowing the history of how meditation came to be can help us figure out what kinds of techniques are available and what may be easy for you specifically. Because developing the right meditation practice involves picking a particular tradition or style that fits for you. And the most successful meditation practices are tailored to the person doing the actual meditating. So now let's focus on the history of meditation throughout humanity and where meditation began. Probably in ancient India about 10,000 years ago with this guy named Shiva. Right, so historical texts indicate that someone named Shiva was essentially the father of meditation, and a lot of Hindu traditions actually worship Shiva as being divine or like a really important godlike figure. So Shiva essentially believed that the universe was made up of two things: cosmic consciousness, which he referred to as Shiva, naming it after like himself, and cosmic energy, which he referred to as Shakti, naming it after his consort, and discovered something called Tantra in the process, which is kind of this general practice that tried to harness Shiva and Shakti to create manifestations in reality. So what that means is he sort of noticed that for anything to be manifest in the universe, we need a particular intention, like a goal or a direction, and some kind of fuel or energy to make that intention happen. So Shiva's followers were known as the Tantrics, who sort of regularly practiced Tantra by harnessing consciousness and energy to make manifestations in the real world. And over time, the Tantrics discovered three kinds of practices: mantra, yantra, and yagna. Now before we talk about these three things, we have to take a slight step back and talk about something else that Shiva discovered other than Tantra, that not many people talk about for some reason when they refer to meditation, and that's psychedelics. Right, so Shiva and the Tantrics realized that there were some herbs that existed around them, like marijuana, mushrooms, and other kinds of substances, and when they interacted with these herbs, that was basically another way to cultivate this consciousness and energy, or Shiva and Shakti, without the help of like any meditation whatsoever. So the first thing people want to know is like, okay, so what are the pros and cons of meditation versus psychedelics? So the first thing to understand is that the things that psychedelics facilitate or create, so like memories, trippy experiences, and stuff like that, are only doing something that we are completely capable of doing on our own anyway without the help of the substance. But the body sort of gets help in facilitating these experiences through something like substances. But it can also be facilitated by something like meditation or like holotropic breath work or things like that. So any substance we put into our body doesn't create anything, it activates things that are already there. So like alcohol activates GABA receptors that are already in our brain, cannabis activates cannabinoid receptors, and it doesn't create something new in our brain. It only turns on or off what's already there. So any experience you can have through psychedelics can absolutely be attained through meditation. And I kind of think about meditation versus psychedelics as if we're trying to like get to it. Let's say we're trying to get to the top of a mountain, right? So meditation is like climbing the mountain with like safety gear, and like generally speaking, unless you really slip up, it's like pretty safe, but also like really slow. And psychedelics is like using a helicopter, which goes up faster but also goes down faster, and is a lot more dangerous if we don't have the proper sort of understanding of how to operate the helicopter. Another analogy is if we're trying to fly a plane, meditation is putting the plane on autopilot while we study in the back and can gradually sort of pick up the pace and disable autopilot on our own accord. And psychedelics is like disabling autopilot, which allows you to sort of increase the thrust by a lot more right off the bat. But even minor turbulences can end up catastrophically. So now if we look at what role psychedelics has in consciousness, when we think about our consciousness and our sense of self, it's a really low entropy state, right? So like what that means is like, I am ... I am something. So I am Indian, I am American, I am smart, I am stupid, I am something. So like that's my identity. But when you use psychedelics, you create a high entropy state of the self. So the sense of self becomes like really disorganized, diffuse, and like messy. And sometimes people who use psychedelics, or maybe you've had a friend like get really high, and they'll say things like, I am connected with the universe, we are all one with the universe, and things like that. And that process of cultivating that level of entropic or cosmic consciousness could be done through psychedelics and meditation or tantra. And now I want to go on a little tangent on psychedelics as a whole, so just as a quick disclaimer that I personally haven't had any experience with psychedelics, so everything I'm saying is either based off of what I've heard from other people or research that I've done on my own. And another disclaimer is that, from a safety perspective, substances and psychedelics should always be done under the guidance of a medical doctor or professional healer, because oftentimes psychedelics that aren't being administered at a professional standard have a high chance of being contaminated and being sort of inappropriately expensive too. So like, that weed your buddy gave you in high school like weeks ago has a high chance of being like dirty, contaminated, and you're probably also like getting scammed for it, right? So it's really sort of a overall kind of net loss kind of scenario. So there are essentially 5 uses of substances or psychedelics: spirituality, healing, creativity, recreation, and substance abuse. So I'm going to highlight the first 2, so like the spirituality and healing components, and talk about the spectrum of like therapeutic versus transpersonal. So therapeutic being like a really low level kind of healing capacity, helps with mental disorders like depression, anxiety, PTSD, phobias, and things like that. And transpersonal being a really high level kind of life-changing spiritual experience, where it really starts to change who we are as a person. So at the very far left is something like MDMA, where it can sort of help you de-stress and wind down and things like that. And then we get to ketamine, which actually dissociates your awareness from your body and mind. So what that means is like we don't mush together our sense of self with our mind and body anymore. And we realize like, hey, I'm not my body or mind, because my body, thoughts, and emotions can all change and I'm still me. And also things like, hey, I'm not my sense of identity either, because before I was a student or before I had a particular sexual orientation, I was still me. So ketamine does things like shut off the default mode network. So essentially, we have this part of our brain that can sort of make us blame ourselves and make things our fault, right? So the ability to say like, it's my fault. And, which a lot of animals actually don't have this capacity. And when people are high on ketamine, they think that nothing is really their fault and like sort of stop blaming themselves and regretting, which also helps with depression because it sort of turns off their default mode network in their brain. In the middle of the spectrum are things like psilocybin and LSD. And this is where we really start to enter spiritual territory, because then we get to ayahuasca, which is basically the most spiritual substance out there. And after that is DMT, or smoked ayahuasca, which is secreted from the tongue of a particular kind of toad. So for spiritual practice, psychedelics are meant to sort of gently or gradually connect. And that space between where you are personally and sort of where you need to go on your spiritual or healing journey by using psychedelics is called liminal space, which should be sort of safely navigated under the guidance of a licensed professional. And, another benefit of using psychedelics under the guidance of a professional is that they're highly trained in identifying the setting, and dosage of the experience. So set is like where the person is mentally and physically in their stage of life. Setting is like taking the psychedelic in a particular area. So maybe that's like outside with someone you trust monitoring you during the experience or something like that. And dosage is how much of the psychedelic to use. So now let's come back to Tantra and talk about mantra practice. Mantra is sort of chanting these particular syllables or phrases of power that we tend to repeat over and over again, almost like a magical spell, that when strung together in a particular way, create a particular kind of effect in the real world. Remember that all meditation techniques follow the pattern of dharana, dhyan, and samadhi. So mantra works on a lot of other different levels other than tantra, which we'll dive into when we talk about the mind later on in the video. But for now, we'll focus on the samadhi or tantra level of mantra, which is when you sort of completely leave the mind behind, right? And you're operating on the level of consciousness. So the tantrics sort of discovered that the universe is composed of cosmic consciousness, and when you direct consciousness in a particular way, like there's a particular oscillation in consciousness, that leads to a particular manifestation of reality. So chanting a mantra is like playing with the cosmic building blocks of reality and generating some kind of weird spiritual vibration that manifests in the real world in a particular kind of way. So in the tradition of mantra, there are going to be mantras about like attaining certain things in this life. So mantras for health, wealth, fame, or even, success and things like that. And the idea is that if you chant these mantras diligently and in the right frame of mind, it'll actually be like a magical spell and create something in this life. So I know this sounds really weird and bizarre, and I personally am pretty skeptical of it myself, but sometimes people will say that there have been times in their life where they sort of bent the universe to their will. So they'll say that there's some gravity in their life that is like pulling them towards a certain goal, which absolutely has a mental component to it, right? So like they're thinking, I want to do this, or this is the life that I want, and are super motivated every day when they wake up. But even if we look at that motivation, sometimes when people are very focused, it seems like the universe kind of gets in line with them, like a spiritual gravity that tugs along other people and circumstances around them, like their luck or like weird forces in their life are being shaped by this like weird force. And if any of that somehow really resonates with you, that's really the level that mantra was designed to work. The most basic mantra is Om, which is believed to be the fundamental vibration of the universe. So we'll talk a lot more about how mantra works in relation to the mind later on in the video, but this was sort of just meant to introduce the more spiritual, esoteric, and super unscientific part of mantra. So the next thing that the tantrics discovered was yantra. A yantra is a tantric symbol of power that sort of cultivates a particular kind of cosmic spiritual energy when you meditate on them or draw them. So meditating on a particular yantra will cultivate a particular kind of spiritual energy, similar to how, there's different mantras, so things for like mantras for wealth, health, success, things like that. There's also yantras for health, wealth, success, and things like that. So there's a lot of different types of yantras, but the most basic and fundamental yantra is a simple equilateral triangle. And a lot of yantras are made up of like complex patterns of triangles because the tantrics believe that the most basic building material in the body, even at the molecular arrangement, is a triangle. There's many kinds of yantras, some in a general circular pattern called mandalas, some in a pyramid formation called merus, and some with numbers called sankhya yantras. The dot in the middle of yantras are called bindus and represent the source of the yantra's sort of cosmic energy and consciousness, and the bigger outer circle represents the infinite space, expansiveness, and ether. The square represents the fixed space, rigidity, and the earth element. Triangles pointing up represent masculine energy and the fire element. Triangles pointing down represent feminine energy and the water element. And so, the fire is always trying to sort of rise upwards and the water is always trying to flow downwards. The last thing they discovered is yajna, which are rituals that are aimed at harnessing this cosmic energy. So yajna is derived from the Sanskrit word yaj, which means sacrifice, not motivated by the attachment to the results. So the tantrics believe that action done with the spirit of self-sacrifice doesn't bind someone to a materialistic life like selfish actions do, but instead frees them from attachment and makes the mind less biased and sort of more open to the truth. So the Pancha Mahayagnas, or the 5 great rituals, are essentially the classification of yagnas that you could possibly do. The first is Brahma Yagna, which involves sacrificing time towards sort of meditation and spirituality and spiritual study, reading like ancient spiritual texts and things like that. The second yagna is Deva Yagna, or Agnihotra, where the sacrifice of various herbs, mantras, and other commonly repeated phrases is accompanied by a fire pit called Havan. So the Havan is believed to purify the mind, but also literally purifies the environment by having a particular kind of smoke that supposedly improves air quality by using a particular kind of burnt herbs as fuel. The third big yagna is Pitra Yagna, which is essentially giving respect to those who have sacrificed for one's well-being, so like family members, ancestors, or even historical figures. The fourth yagna is Atidhi Yagna, which is sacrificing self-service with welcome hospitality to all guests who need service, even if uninvited. So essentially servicing yourself to guests. The fifth biggest yagna is Bali Vaishvadev Yagna, which is sacrificing help and service to those who can't make it on their own. So like helping people in need and volunteering and assistance and things like that. So the common factor of all yagna is selfless action done with a detached mindset without worrying about the fruits of those actions. So somehow by practicing these 3 things, mantra, yantra, and yagna, the tantrics kind of figured out what the nature of the universe is. And they took all of their revelations and discoveries and molded them into yoga. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit word yuj, which means yolk, not like the middle of an egg, but something that binds 2 things together. And yoga is the practice of learning, discovering, or realizing how to be free from oneself, but also while joining or connecting to what they call the infinite consciousness. So you'll hear sometimes in like Eastern thinking that, I am a piece of the divine. And the idea is that there's this sea of cosmic consciousness called Brahman, and what we are is tiny little droplets that come out of the ocean and get trapped in these like bodies. And as long as we exist as droplets, we have our own unique identity, right? So if I pull out a drop of water from the ocean, that drop is no longer a part of the ocean, even though it's from the ocean, and it sort of has its own identity and individuality. And when that drop remerges with the ocean, it actually loses all individuality and becomes one with the source. And so the general goal of yoga is to re-merge into Brahman. And once we finally re-merge with Brahman, they call that enlightenment or moksha, which means freedom. So Patanjali, who some people sort of consider to be the super wise yogi and father of yoga, essentially provided a definition for yoga. by saying Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodhana, which is Sanskrit for yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. Fluctuations of the mind being like emotions, memories, ego, intellect, things like that. So not only is yoga the process of enlightenment, where we join the infinite, whatever that means, but it's also the process of stopping thoughts and emotions. So the difference between yoga and tantra is that yoga is more focused on making change in the self or the internal world, whereas tantra is more focused on making like mystical changes in the universe on the external world, and like it's sort of more esoteric in nature. And the yogis originally discovered that there are 4 ways to do this yoga stuff of like stopping our mind and joining the infinite and stuff like that. Bhakti Yoga, enlightenment via devotion, Karma Yoga, enlightenment via action, Jnana Yoga, enlightenment via understanding, and Raja Yoga, enlightenment via willpower. But there are also a few other ways of practicing yoga that have cropped up over time that are more modern in nature, but also really cool, some of which include Kundalini Yoga, or enlightenment via Kundalini Shakti, we'll go over what that is, Hatha Yoga, enlightenment via body postures and breath, what most people in the West think of as yoga, Kriya Yoga, enlightenment via consciousness and mind, Svara Yoga, enlightenment via nostrils, I know it sounds weird, and Nada Yoga, or enlightenment via music. So let's sort of start from the beginning. Bhakti Yoga is all about devotion, and it's essentially attaining enlightenment through devotional practice. So a lot of people think Bhakti Yoga is all about religion, but even though it could include religion, that's not exactly the case. So a religion is basically a set of beliefs that if you follow, then something good will happen. So like in the Judeo-Christian religions, you devote yourself to the ideals or teachings of a particular God. So like Jesus or the Father or the Holy Spirit or Yahweh or Allah. And in the Eastern religions, it's like Vishnu and Shiva and Kali. And they all essentially say that devoting yourself to a particular God or ideal is the way to become divine. But the yogis actually claim that it isn't actually the object of devotion that matters when it comes to the self. And notice that gods changed over time, there's tons of gods and religions, and it doesn't really make sense that a particular religion is better than another religion, which is interestingly enough what a lot of religious conflict is centered upon, right? This idea of, oh, my God is better than your God. So the yogis believe that it's actually the act of devotion to the object that is the important thing, not the object of devotion itself. Because they basically looked at religious people and said that some people who practice religion are assholes and some people who practice religion are great people. Therefore, it's not the religion itself that makes someone enlightened or not enlightened. It's actually the degree to which you devote yourself to the object. So they say that when it comes to the self, it doesn't matter whether you worship Zeus or Jesus or Shiva. The actual act of devotion is what's important. The other cool thing about Bhakti Yoga is that it doesn't just include only religion, and you can devote yourself to a particular ideal, like climate change, for example, and if you put your heart, soul, effort, and mind behind a particular ideal and devote yourself to that, you will become spiritually purified in that process as well. So Bhakti Yoga is about setting some sort of object, doesn't have to be religious, but it can if you want to, and saying, this is more important than I am, and I am going to become a vessel of achieving this thing. And devoting yourself to something. So people ask, does that mean I can devote myself to bad things, like hurting people? So technically, yes. But even though the object of your devotion doesn't matter, the manner of your devotion does matter, like how you become devoted. So sometimes people will seem to be for a particular cause, but they're like spiritually bereft, right? So whatever they devote themselves to doesn't actually result in them becoming like humble, knowledgeable, spiritually grown, less egotistical, suffering less, and things like that. So since those kinds of devotions don't work, that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate devotions. It's the way in which you devote yourself that's important, not the object of devotion. So the yogis also realize that not all people are the same, and that you can actually get enlightened without God or devotion at all. So Karma Yoga is the path of action, or enlightenment via action, and Karma Yoga says that if you want to get enlightened, you can do it through doing good deeds, and you don't actually have to meditate or worship someone. You can simply be a secular, atheistic, good person, and if you devote yourself to actions and doing a good job, like doing good deeds and selfless actions and making the world a better place, then in that process, you can start to purify yourself and become enlightened. So according to the yogis, every action has a reason and a resulting effect. That effect having impressions or changes on the body and the mind. So like if someone wakes up early in the morning and exercises, that action has a particular impression on their mind and kind of sets them up to wake up early the next day to exercise. And these impressions are known as vasanas. Vasanas condition our mind to react to situations based on past experiences, kind of like a habit. And vasanas are born from actions, and actions are born from vasanas. But the root cause of our actions tend to be desire, which is a product of attachment or ego. Conversely, vasanas are the result of the attachment caused by our actions, and those attachments cultivate even more desire or ego. Actions born from desire and egoisticness are called vikaras and can be removed through the creation of mental impressions or memories known as samskaras. So weeding out vasanas is what you need to do to free the mind from this sort of never-ending attachment action cycle. And that's essentially the goal of Karma Yoga and how Karma Yoga leads to enlightenment. And one of the methods that Karma Yogis weed out vasanas with are through yagna, or self-sacrifice. So Karma Yogis tend to be activists, so like MLK or Mahatma Gandhi, or people like that. And there's a little bit of overlap between Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga, because both types of yogis can basically devote themselves to actions and make the world a better place. The next path to enlightenment that the yogis discovered is Jnana Yoga. Jnanam is Sanskrit for knowledge, more specifically understanding, and Jnana Yoga is sort of the path of contemplation or almost philosophy. So the yogis sort of realize that you can literally kind of sit like in a cave and think about things, right? And almost brute force contemplation, or you can kind of go out into the real world and sort of live life and experience things to gain understanding, and that's also another path to enlightenment. So basically, the strategy for attaining happiness for most people on Earth right now tends to fall closest under this bucket called Jnana Yoga. And Jnana Yogis are the ones who made a lot of the philosophical and more understanding the nature of things through discoveries and things like that. But even though most people's strategies in life tends to fall under Jnana Yoga, there's a difference between passively experiencing life and actually sitting down and dedicating some amount of time to understand stuff. A good example of this is a lot of people watch anime, and when you watch anime for 5 years, you may accidentally or passively pick up some kind of basic Japanese of what that show's talking about, like nanikore or baka and things like that. But if I actually spend 3 months practicing Japanese on Duolingo or something like that, that'll be a far more efficient and effective way of sort of becoming proficient in learning Japanese, right? So there's a big difference between deliberate practice and sort of passive learning. And that's the same difference between being a Jnana Yogi and 90% of humanity right now. So Jnana Yoga is not quite logic, it's more contemplation. Now logic can come out of contemplation, but logic can actually make you reflective, right? Just because you learn something logically doesn't make you change. And there's literally a different process or style of thinking between reflecting and logic. And even though the two may seem similar, logic doesn't lead to change, whereas reflecting does lead to change. So even if you look at your own thought process, there's different ways in which you can think about something, right? And some ways in which you think about stuff will cause you to learn and change something, and other ways won't cause you to learn and change something. So Jnana Yoga is the process of teasing that apart and doing a lot of reflection on the nature of the universe, the nature of self, happiness, and things like that. And you can essentially kind of brute force enlightenment that way. The last of the 4 main paths of enlightenment that the yogis originally discovered was called Ashtanga Yoga or Raja Yoga, which translates to union of kings, but more practically means enlightenment via willpower. So Raja Yoga is actually completely different from the other 3 paths because it says that there's actually a stepwise process of attaining enlightenment. So first you do this, and then once you're good at that, then you do this, and then once you're good at that, then you do this, and so on and so forth. So Raja Yoga has 8 steps, right? So step 1 is yamas and niyamas, which translates to societal interactions and personal interactions. So the yamas include ahimsa or non-violence, satya or truthfulness, asteya or non-stealing, aparigraha or non-possessiveness, and brahmacharya, which sometimes people think of as celibacy, but the more literal translation is to dwell in Brahman, or more practically means non-lustfulness. So if you look at the yamas, they're all societal observances, right? They're how we interact with the outside world. So the niyamas are all about how we interact with ourselves. And there's 5 niyamas too. Shuddha, or cleanliness. Swadhyaya, which is self-study, or looking within yourself and self-understanding. Santosha, or happiness. Tapas, or asceticism and kind of harsh, strict self-discipline. And Ishvara Pranidhana, which sort of means surrender to God, but more practically means recognizing the true nature of self within you. So Raja Yoga says that if you want to purify yourself, first, you have to adhere to some of these societal and personal standards, and there are certain things you have to observe with how you interact with the outside world as well as yourself before you can get to the rest. So after yamas and niyamas come asana, and these are essentially yoga postures. So you might have seen how a lot of people who like practice like yoga and meditation and spirituality and stuff will do these like body postures. And the general idea is that doing the yoga posture actually helps purify you and makes your body optimally functioning to prepare you for the next steps in Raja Yoga. So asana is basically how we get our body in shape for meditation, because our mind sort of knows the stance of like how to focus by doing a particular posture. The fourth step is pranayama, which is sort of breath practices designed to purify and cleanse your vital life energy and calm your mind to prepare for meditation. So the idea is that we each have this vital life energy, and if you go like physically, if you look at what's the difference between a body before it dies, what's the difference between a body before it dies and after it dies? So like 1 second before they die, they're alive, and 1 second after they die, they're dead. The yogis believe that there's this vital life energy that flows throughout our body called prana or chi, which uses breath as its medium for entering our body. And pranayama is the practice of boosting and cleansing this vital life energy. After pranayama comes pratyahara, which is the practice of sensory withdrawal or sensory control. So like when we try to meditate, one thing we really need to do is restrain our sensory impulses and signals, right? If I'm meditating and my mind keeps like wandering and gets distracted by like how my face feels really itchy right now, or the smell of bacon downstairs, or I keep like looking at things, the yogis sort of realize that focusness and sort of focus and one-pointedness of the mind involves restraining our sense organs and being able to like put our attention where we want it to go instead of chasing after sensory stimuli. So pratyahara is the practice of restraining our sense organs. And if we want to do something like study, the problem is that our sense organs are actually sending us all kinds of like pulls on our attention. And the cool thing about pratyahara is that it actually gives us a lot of control over our life. Because if you really pay attention, your impulses, desires, and things that prevent you from doing the things that you want to do are actually rooted in your sense organs, right? So when I smell really delicious and fatty food, it's once I actually smell that fatty food that makes me want to crave fatty food and ultimately eat fatty food. And the yogis discover that if you want to get control of your life and if you want to get control of your mind, you have to learn how to control the sense organs. So after pratyahara comes like actual meditation. So dharana, and if you get lucky, then you find yourself in dhyan. And if you get really lucky, then you wind up from dhyan to samadhi, which is temporary enlightenment. And as you progress with all 8 steps, you grow spiritually, which means you get closer to enlightenment. So now let's go into a little bit more detail into the first 5 steps of Raja Yoga. So remember that the yamas are all about societal observances. And one of the yamas that I want to highlight right now is satya, because I think satya is a good example that shows how Raja Yoga isn't really about like morality or doing what's right or being a good person or things like that, but it's really sort of about spiritual growth. And oftentimes you'll see that people who engage in spiritual practice have improvements in their mental health and have better focus and things like that. So why exactly is that? And sometimes, you'll hear from people who practice spirituality, or you see like these Instagram stories with quotes like live in the present, right? Learn how to detach and let go, right? Everyone says learn how to do this, learn how to do that. But the real question is, how do I do that? Why should I do that? Right? And like, how do I learn how to live in the present and let go and detach and all this stuff? But the cool thing is that if you follow the yamas, they'll sort of facilitate this kind of spiritual thinking automatically, and they're a pretty solid way of learning how to do these things. So remember that satya means truthfulness, and we can actually learn how we function, how to live in the present, and how to detach all through the lens of this yama. So the first sort of meditation exercise I'll share in this video is see how long you can go without saying a single lie, right? See how many days you can go without lying. Now, what goes into lying? And if you stop lying, how does it start to shape your life? What are the benefits of practicing like truthfulness? Satya helps us do 3 things: increase awareness of the present moment, shape how we act, and learn how to let go. So if I tell you, see how long you can go without lying, and you actually commit to it, suddenly you start paying a lot more attention to every single word that you say, right? Life stops becoming autopilot, and your awareness really comes down to the present. And satya sort of compresses your attention to the present, because you really have to pay attention to every single thing that comes out of your mouth. Most of the time when we lie, we do it without paying attention and we don't really realize we're lying. But if you lie while doing the Satya practice, then you'll actually do it intentionally, which we'll touch on sort of more in detail later on. So in the beginning, it can feel really exhausting and like cognitively intense to avoid lying. And the reason it's so cognitively intense is because your brain is rewiring, right? You're teaching your brain the new skill of being aware in the present moment with your thoughts and your words. So in the neuroscience of meditation, one of the mechanisms in which meditation improves sobriety in addictions, like alcohol, pornography, or even video games, is by increasing awareness of the present moment and of internal signals. And a lot of the times, our internal signals, like sadness, feeling ashamed, like feeling bored, or a particular desire, is what drives people to use the substance and kind of calm things down. So as you increase awareness of your present moment, it gives you control over your addictive impulses, and Satya helps by forcing you to pay attention to what you say and what's going on in your mind. The second thing Satya does is shape your actions, because if you really commit to not lying, you'll actually start to see some subtle behavioral shifts, right? Because a lot of things we do that aren't too great for ourselves or other people and are kind of unhealthy in nature, we allow ourselves to do those kinds of actions because we know we're going to lie about them later. So as you're about to do something that you're going to have to lie about later, you might actually catch yourself, right? Like, hey, if I do this, then I'm going to have to lie about it later, which means that I'll mess up the practice as a whole. So when you really commit to Satya, over time, your life will start to change and get shaped in a different way, in a way where you don't have to lie about it. And if we were to think about like our dream life, right, chances are most of the features of that dream life would be things that you wouldn't want to lie about. So there's almost going to be like this reverse engineering going on cognitively in your head, where you're like, if I can't lie, I have to shape my actions back here so that I don't actually have to lie about them later on. The third way Satya helps is by teaching people detachment, because once you truly commit to Satya, sometimes you'll do things that maybe you used to lie about to avoid the retaliation of, but now since you've committed to not lying, you're gonna share those things with people and the consequences will happen. Right, you start to open yourself up to the consequences that you used to avoid by lying. And if we think about why does a human being lie, fundamentally it's all about control, right? Like if I tell the truth, then another human being might respond to you in a particular way. So you're trying to control the thoughts and actions of another human being through a lie. Because if you tell them something else, then they'll respond this way. So lying is all about control. And the more you lie, the more you're attempting to control other people. The way you cultivate these concepts of detachment, like letting go and surrender, is literally as simple as not lying. Because by letting go of lying, I'm also letting go of control and forcing myself to face the consequences of my actions. So Satya is a great way of starting the process of surrendering, letting go, letting life kind of take its course, right? Not being like so much of a control freak and being an honest person. So surrender is essentially saying, do what you're gonna do and let the rest of the world respond in whatever way. And if we think about the freedom we gain from surrendering and letting go, it's all about letting the consequences happen in whichever way they're gonna happen. So Satya is an example of one of the yamas of Raja Yoga, and now let's move on to one of the niyamas, Shuddha. Shuddhi is Sanskrit for cleanliness, and the yogis realized that optimal function of the body and mind can't happen unless the body and mind are both clean and pure, and a combination of intention plus manifestation is most optimal with cleanliness. So generally speaking, in life, the days that are hard and we can't really accomplish what we set out to do, what we call bad days, are the days where your mind is kind of cloudy and foggy, and there's this like sluggishness to your body, right? And a common experience you'll hear from like students in university is that brain fog literally prevents them from studying. So when we shower, no one after coming out of the shower says like, I feel terrible right now, my mind is super cluttered, like I can't think straight about anything as soon as the shower is over. And all these things called shower thoughts on social media are like these super profound thoughts that people have when they take a shower. So the cleansing experience of taking a shower, or even like laundry or like organizing your room and things like that, is very conducive for profound and optimal mental function or thinking. And when people finish a shower, they feel like invigorated, refreshed, like clearer headed, energetic, and their mind works a little bit better. Another cool thing about cleanliness is that there's a lot of clinical studies on patients with depression that show a strong correlation between the cleanliness of their room and how depressed they are. So like generally the more depressed people get, the messier their room gets, and like vice versa. And what we find is that for someone after their major depressive episode, one of the best things they can do is actually clean their room. So in depression, it's often a struggle between like you're trying to get out of bed and clean, but they have like a really hard time with that. But when they start to get a little burst of energy and clean something, they start to feel a little bit better and their depression actually starts to lift a tiny bit. And if they can use that extra energy to clean a bit more, they feel even better. And if they're really able to get a handle on depression and like literally spend the whole day just cleaning, like completely cleaning their room or house or general like environment or whatever, then they feel like awesome afterwards. And not just in depression, but in ADHD, when people who struggle with ADHD have a cluttered house, they can't really concentrate on anything they set out to do in their house. So what people with ADHD often have to do in order to work is like fastidiously clean their entire place. So now let's tunnel deeper into how cleaning induces optimal function. Researchers have found that a clean environment leads to more optimal mental function because our brain essentially has two ways of attending to things. So like the focus of our attention, if I'm trying to like study or write an essay or things like that, there are two things that determine what my brain focuses on and how well it's able to focus: top-down attention and bottom-up attention. Top-down thinking is when I tell my mind to do something. I'm basically recruiting all of my mental faculties to listen to what I'm saying. So I'm sending an order as like a general or king from the top to all the other parts of my brain and telling them, hey, right now all of y'all need to get in order because we've got to study. So like everyone needs to calm down because we don't want to be distracted and like thinking about something else. So you're basically sending an order to your mind, which comes from these things called the cerebral cortices, to tell it to sort of get in gear and like focus on one thing. So that's the first way our brain attends to things. The second thing that determines what my brain focuses on is bottom-up mental attention. And bottom-up thinking is basically sensory stimuli, right? So like sound, sight, smell, things like that. So for example, if I'm walking down the street with a friend talking about like video games or something, that's a situation where the top-down part of my brain is functioning. So it's in control when I'm talking. Then all of a sudden, let's say I see a snake on the road or I hear a call from my phone. Earlier, I told my brain, let's think about video games, but when I see a snake in the path, which is like something we really fear and are attached to avoiding, my top-down thinking gets interrupted and shatters. So now we have a bottom-up stimulus, actually our visual cortex, telling our cortices, okay, we need to like shut up about video games because there's literally a snake in our path and we like really don't want to run into the snake because we're gonna be attached, like we're attached to our health and the snake could actually put our health at risk. Another example is if you try to study in a noisy environment, you might understand how your top-down thinking is saying like, let's focus on the book, we need to study, let's study. And you know, there's like people talking here, like kids are laughing there, like cell phones are going off everywhere. So your bottom-up thinking is actually getting bombarded and disrupting your top-down thinking, which is why you can't ever study in a noisy environment as long as you're attached to the sensory stimuli. So if you look at what your mind focuses on, there's a constant communication, sometimes even a war, between your top-down thinking and your bottom-up thinking. And researchers have literally found that if you have a cluttered environment, like a messy room, and you try to perform top-down thinking, so you're giving your mind a task, like let's finish our homework, or let's study, or like let's work on our resume, or apply for a job. If there's a lot of sensory clutter, so like there's clothes and pillows all over the place, you know, you smell like bacon cooking on like downstairs or something, there's like a leaf blower and like air conditioning you can hear in the background, your arms are super itchy and like you can taste nacho cheese, Doritos crumbs in your mouth, right? There's going to be all sorts of like sensory signals from your visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and somatosensory cortex, which is basically like your five senses cortices, all about like messy stuff in the room that gets sent to your bottom-up thinking. And that bottom-up circuit is going to be highly active, and it'll actually take a portion of your mental energy to suppress all those sensory signals from bottom-up thinking. So researchers have literally found that it's harder to concentrate, so it's harder for people's top-down thinking to work when their attention is getting bombarded by all this crap from their bottom-up attention from a bunch of random sensory signals. So literally, if you clean your room, it'll be much easier to accomplish the task that you set out to do in your room. And now we're going to take a slight tangent into human physiology, because one of the most important parts of sleep is to clean out a neurochemical substance in our brain called adenosine, which is essentially a waste product of our brain that increases over time and makes us not want to do pleasurable activities and like sort of makes us feel sluggish, kind of like the opposite of dopamine. And physiologically, if we're not able to clean out the adenosine in our brain through sleep, it's really hard to function the next day. And not just sleep, but even neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, and even something like mad cow all have a common problem, that our body is not able to clear out these like proteinaceous crappy materials because our neurons get cluttered with this junk. And our inability to clear out that junk in our brain leads to neuronal death and diseases like dementia. And treatment, like herbs for these diseases, like ashwagandha, which has been like an Ayurvedic remedy for thousands of years, actually function by helping increase the clearance of toxic substances and proteinaceous materials from our neurons. And now we're going to go back to like mental stuff and talk about psychotherapy. So for example, when someone has trauma, they take all of this emotional junk and they suppress it very deep down in their mind and try to forget it. And it kind of manifests in all sorts of healthy ways, or sometimes toxically healthy ways. I know it sounds weird. And what psychotherapists help patients do is like recall those memories and kind of vent them out of their mind so they can be cleaned out. So oftentimes in psychotherapy, there will be these moments of emotional catharsis where past emotions well up and people have this realizing feeling where even though it's emotionally very intense, they feel kind of lighter and cleaner afterwards. And if you talk to people who have gone through psychotherapy, the word that their mind chooses to describe the experience is clean, right? Like something that's been stuck in their teeth for a long time finally gets like pulled out and like washed through the sink. So now we start to see that the yogis were really onto something when they claim that shuddhi, or cleanliness, is a very important part of optimal function of the mind. And in order to meditate properly, we have to start by like cleansing our body and mind. And the cool thing is now we have a lot of scientific evidence that backs up their claims. So the next question becomes like, okay, cool, you've told me how to practice satya by seeing how long I can go without lying. How do I practice shuddhi? So a good chunk of meditation techniques at the end are actually shuddhi practices designed to like clean out our body, mind, and spirit and prepare our mind for that tranquil state of meditation in dhyan. In addition to shuddhi meditation, you can even practice simpler things with personal hygiene, like learning how to shower every day, like brushing your teeth and flossing, washing your hands every time you use the restroom, doing laundry, and in general, keeping your body kind of like cleaner. Another thing is to like getting rid of constipation, because constipation causes buildup in our digestive colon or our digestive system, which leads to low degrees of inflammation that negatively affect our mood. So eating and drinking the right kinds of foods to make our bowels moving every day also sort of falls under shuddhi. The second thing is cleaning your space. So things like cleaning your room or even some kinds of music. So like some religions and cultures have like purifying vibes and stuff. Himalayan sage or incense can really make people feel like they've kind of like purified their environment. And literally getting fresh air into the house or going out for walks and things like that. So the cool thing is that there's actually studies that show that plant aerosols, which is the compounds that plants release, actually have beneficial effects on like mood and anxiety. So like literally through smelling something via your olfactory receptors, your mood increases. And lastly, with mental function, is like being clean with technology. So like getting your inbox to zero, having a nice clean desktop and phone that doesn't bombard you with sensory stimuli, and even stuff like psychotherapy, which is a really useful way to like take like deep set beliefs that you learned about the world and all that psychological junk, like resentments, regret, and like other memories that cause you suffering and stuff, could actually be worked on either by yourself if you know what you're doing, or with someone like a psychotherapist or a coach, or sometimes even religious or devotional institutions and things like that offer similar services, and are a great way to sort of really clean out the mind and unburden some of those things. And the last sort of practical tip is to ask yourself, what makes me feel clean? What makes my environment feel pure? And engaging in those activities is really the best way to practice shuddhi. And being mentally, physically, and spatially clean is a great way to increase productivity. So satya and shuddhi are great examples of how the yamas and niyamas of Raja Yoga help people do these things that not many people explain well. Because with the explosion of mindfulness, everyone says these things like highly, wonderfully sounding, spiritually likable phrases on Instagram posts and yoga calendars, like learn how to let go and like live in the present, be pure and clean, all without actually understanding how to do that or why we may want to do that. And the yamas and niyamas aren't about morality or religion, right? Like, you should do this because God tells you to do it. The yogis were actually very scientific with experimentation, hypotheses, and basically figured out what works. So after the yamas and niyamas come asana. And asana is essentially the way we get ready for meditation. And the general idea is that one of the fastest ways to stop the mind from getting distracted is to add some degree of physical pressure to it. Because the energy of the mind and the energy of the body tend to be inversely proportional, where the calmer our body is, the more active our mind is, and the calmer our mind is, the more active our body is. So the goal of doing a yoga posture isn't actually to make us more flexible. What actually happens when we do yoga poses is we use our sense of touch, or somatosensory cortex in our brain, to bombard our mind with all sorts of sensory stimuli through our bottom-up thinking, to the point where it's literally hard for us to think about anything else. And the more complicated the yoga posture is, the harder it is for us to think. And so when we tell our body to do something, like touch our toes for example, our mind's going to be very focused on doing that action, which makes it less likely to think about the past or future, therefore forcing our mind to live in the present. The primary goal of doing asana is to focus our mind, not let it think about the past or future, and overload it with sensory stimuli, all for the purpose of calming it down. And now we'll tunnel a little bit into the mechanism behind focus and somatosensory cortex. So there's a lot of clinical studies that show a relationship between the mental health state of patients and their physical symptoms of pains that they experience, right? And people may think, of course someone who's physically in pain will probably be in an unhappy mental state. And while that's true, oftentimes the mental health state precedes the physical pain. So the negative mental health actually came first. And once the mental health aspect was treated, that's actually when the physical pain started to go away. So even though the pain was real, the source of that pain actually wasn't anatomical in nature. So they didn't get an injury or get hurt or things like that. The source was actually more mental in nature. So one example of a clinician who focused in this field is Dr. John Sarno. And he found that helping patients deal with some of their most repressed childhood or current negative mental health and life situations actually yielded better results for his chronic pain and acute injury patients. So when patients are in a stressful state mentally, the body actually limits the amount of blood flow to those areas in order to decrease their stress of thinking about those repressed and acute stress thoughts, and instead forces their mind to focus on a physical problem, like a low back pain, which functions sort of as a distraction to not overwhelm the mind. Another example of this sort of mechanism is actually self-injurious behavior that's not suicidal. So things like cutting, burning, and things like that are actually interesting because evolutionarily what human beings do when they self-harm is the thing that causes the least damage to their body and also hurts the most. With cutting, it's very superficial cuts. So the strange thing is that if you talk to people who engage in self-injurious behavior, what you often find is that their goal in the self-injurious behavior is actually meditative in nature, where eliciting the cut over and over again distracts them from thoughts and emotions that they dislike, and the intensity of their pain is so great that they literally can't think about anything else, and it shifts their attention away from their mind. So people will actually manually induce this principle of utilizing pain as a distraction from their top-down thinking. And it doesn't have to be only pain and self-injurious behavior, but even other forms of repetitive, prolonged sensory overload like video games, social media, or YouTube, music, smelling things that most people wouldn't smell, or even food and some kinds of eating disorders, all oftentimes have this common element of using your sense organs to distract the mind because you don't want to think about certain thoughts or feel certain emotions. And that's essentially one of the ways that yoga postures help by serving as a powerful sensory grounding meditation technique, which means that it's a meditation technique almost similar to self-injurious behavior or watching videos a lot that makes it really easy to focus all of your attention on a particular sense organ, like your sense of touch, on your body by doing a particular yoga posture. Which when you focus on your body, you stop thinking thoughts and feeling emotions. The fourth step of Raja Yoga is pranayama, which means controlling your vital energies, but more practically means breathing techniques. So yogis believe that there's this vital life energy called prana or chi that exists kind of all throughout the universe, and the way in which we interact with prana is by breathing. So the medium that prana uses to enter our body and mind is breath. And once prana enters our body, it kind of circulates all throughout us and lets us live. And literally, if you ask yourself, what's the difference between someone who's dead and alive? It's their breath. So if you look at all 8 steps of Raja Yoga, the last 3 are all meditation. The first 2 are all about personal and societal observances, which help us with spiritual growth. And asana is all about preparing the body and mind for meditation. So what exactly is pranayama and pratyahara? Dhyan means no mind state. So if you ask yourself, what is the mind? On a very basic level, the mind is emotions and thoughts. right? The mind produces certain kinds of thoughts with how our top-down and bottom-up thinking focuses, and it also feels certain emotions. If we think about our mind like a planet, emotions are kind of like the weather of the mind, and thoughts are like the citizens of the mind. And the yogis claim that if you want to turn off your mind, controlling your thoughts was possible through pratyahara, and controlling your emotional state was possible through pranayama. So how exactly does our breath affect our emotion? When people are stressed out, we'll often tell them to take deep breaths. But does that actually work? Does our mind influence the way that we breathe, or does breathing influence our mental state? Does your breath change when you're feeling a certain way? So in anxiety, we know that people hyperventilate, so our mood does in fact affect our breath. But is it a two-way street where it works the other way around? So if you tell someone to hyperventilate, will they start feeling anxious? And it turns out that the answer is yes. In studies on anxiety, they'll have subjects breathe from a gas mask that has 7.5% increased CO2 or carbon dioxide, and this concentration of CO2 mimics hyperventilation, which actually induces physiologic and neuroscientific changes consistent with those of anxiety. So the most controlled way we as a human species know right now to induce anxiety in another human being is actually by having them breathe a particular concentration of air. So there is in fact a connection between our breath and our emotions. And it's actually a two-way street where feeling a certain way can cause you to breathe a certain way, and breathing a certain way will cause you to feel a certain way. And this principle is actually the way that most things in our body work, because our body and mind have this systems of reciprocal feedback, which means that there's usually always a two-system loop, right? There's a loop between two systems, which is one of the principles behind homeostasis. So for example, when we're hungry, our brain sends out chemical signals that makes us crave food. And so when we eat something, our stomach stretches, and when our stomach physically stretches from when we eat, our stomach then sends signals back to your brain to help you feel full. And a really fascinating thing is that there's even studies where research assistants, under the guidance of researchers, would practice certain facial expressions. So assistant 1 would practice angry faces, assistant 2 would practice happy faces, another assistant practice fearful faces, and another assistant practice sad faces. Right? And over time, what the researcher accidentally discovered is that his assistant practicing angry faces started to become angry and irritable and kind of snappy at his colleagues. His assistant practicing fearful faces all the time actually started to feel fear and would stop coming to lab meetings as a whole. And the researcher assistant making happy faces was more buoyant and happy kind of day to day. And so literally almost everything in our body, including facial expressions versus mood, is a two-way street and a feedback loop, where literally making a certain kind of face for a prolonged period of time can start to affect your mood and behavior. So now we know, okay, breathing affects mood and mood affects breathing. So what is the way in which these two things interact? So what are the qualities and dimensions of a particular breath versus another kind of breath? So breath has two major components, speed and depth. Angry breathing is fast and deep, compared to anxious breathing, which is also pretty rapid, but it's also quite small. So it's fast and shallow. Then there's also calm breathing, which is slow and deep. And then there's even normal breathing, which is not too fast and also not too deep. So you can kind of graph this out with using the axes of speed and depth, and you can actually plot out the different emotions based on their breath qualities. So then the question becomes, can we literally actively control our mind, more specifically our emotions, through our breath? And the answer is absolutely yes. So if you look at the ancient yogic system of pranayama, or what's known as qigong in China, these systems demonstrate that the way to control your mind is through your breathing. When someone would come to yogis in ancient India and say, I want to attain enlightenment and everlasting peace and happiness and be happier in life, how do I control my mind? The first thing that the yogis would actually teach them was a breathing exercise, because the yogis said that if you breathe in this pattern, then you'll feel this way. And if you breathe in this pattern, then you'll feel this way. So learn to breathe in this way. So the pranayama are particular breathing techniques that are used to cultivate a particular attitude of mind, or cultivate particular emotions. So the next question is okay, cool, so altering your breathing can help you control your mind by changing your emotion. But what exactly is this prana stuff? So this is the part where we sort of completely leave science and common human experiences completely behind and talk more about yogic theory and how they believed it works. So remember that prana, or what's called qi in ancient China, is believed to be vital life energy that's flowing sort of all throughout the universe. And human beings use breath as the medium to move prana into our body. So there's something called the pranamaya kosha, which translates to life energy sheath or life energy layer, which is believed to be one of the 5 layers of a human being. And the pranamaya kosha has these things called nadis, which are basically channels or tubes in which this prana life energy stuff flows through. So the yogis believe that there's about 72,000 nadis all throughout our body, but the 3 primary nadis are Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. The Ida nadi is connected to our left nostril and governs things like calmness, restfulness, like digestion, and also the moon. And the Pingala nadi is connected to our right nostril and governs like energeticness, activeness, restlessness, action, and the sun. When both of these nadis become balanced or we do certain things to our breath, then a third nadi awakens, which is the Sushumna nadi. And the Sushumna nadi is what a lot of the 114 chakras are connected to, with 108 of the chakras being active. A lot more on this whole chakra stuff later. So when we inhale oxygen through our Ida or Pingala, prana vayu or wind life energy travels into our body. And when we exhale, prana vayu leaves our body and enters the outside world. So when we inhale, we're literally receiving life, and when we exhale carbon dioxide, we're letting go of all that life energy and what stops us from dying. And so now we'll look at the 5 different types of pranavayus, or pancha pranavayus, which translates to 5 wind life energies. So the first of the pancha pranavayus is prana, which is based near the heart region and lung region, and correlates with inhalation and receiving. The opposing pranavayu of prana is apana, which is the pranavayu of letting go or exhalation, and is based in the pelvic floor or lower abdomen. And this prana is believed to be where major kind of excretory functions happen, with apana moving downwardly in the same direction as gravity. So you can kind of think about prana and apana as like opposites. The third prana is samana, which means even, and samana regulates metabolic processes. This prana is based in the navel or stomach region and is all about digestion and assimilation. The fourth pranavayu is vyana, which manages all flowing things in our body, like veins and arteries. And this prana isn't necessarily based in like a particular location since it's kind of everywhere, but it moves outward and radiates out towards our like head, limbs, and legs. And vyana is all about circulation. The last of the pancha pranavayus is udana. The seat of the udana prana is the throat, and this prana governs like expression, because this area around the throat is all about talking and expression. Even if you look at like anxiety, so a lot of people get worried about public speaking, oftentimes they'll literally feel choked up in the throat. And the yogis claim this happens because the udana prana is blocked, and when the mind is clear and focused, the udana prana is set to open up, and whatever you have to speak is spoken openly. The 5th step of Raja Yoga, and the last aspect of Raja Yoga, which we'll talk about for now, is pratyahara. So remember that meditation is the process of turning off the mind, and on a basic level, the mind is emotions and thoughts. Pranayama is all about controlling our emotional state, and so pratyahara is all about controlling our thoughts. Pratyahara translates to sensory withdrawal or sensory control. And if you look at where thoughts come from, they come from 2 places: memories and sense organs. So remember from the Shuddhi portion of this chapter that when it comes to thoughts, there's 2 kinds of thinking, right? There's top-down thinking and bottom-up thinking. And top-down thinking is basically thinking that we do when we give our mind a command. So like right now, me and my friend are having a conversation about like video games. And so I'm going to think about gaming. Or right now I have to like write a really good essay for next week. So let me brainstorm different ideas to like really get a sense of like what I need to write about. And top-down thinking is basically our default sort of way of thinking as we go through life. The second form of thinking we have is bottom-up thinking. And bottom-up thinking is all about sensory stimuli that our 5 senses give us: our sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste. And depending on what we're not detached from, our attention is either going to be on our top-down thinking or our bottom-up thinking at any given time. Sometimes even a combination of both. So if I'm walking down the street and talking to my friend about like college, my top-down thinking is going to be producing thoughts about like college and classes and professors and things like that. And since there isn't any sensory stimuli that I haven't not already normalized to with homeostasis, like my clothes or like the backpack that I'm wearing on my body or the feeling of the road under my shoes, all of my attention is going to be either on the thoughts produced by my top-down thinking or the words that my friend is saying that I'm hearing. Now let's say as I'm walking, I see a turtle, my sense of sight provided me with the data from my visual cortex of a turtle nearby. And now my bottom-up attention is going to activate and produce thoughts about the turtle. And because I personally think turtles are kind of cool, my attention is going to go to the thoughts produced by my bottom of thinking circuitry, and I'll switch from talking about college to talking about that turtle over there. Now let's say someone else was in my shoes and they actually didn't feel anything particular about turtles, or they didn't care about turtles, or they've practiced pratyahara, then even though they've technically seen the turtle the same way I did, their bottom-up thinking won't actually produce that many thoughts about the turtle, so their attention won't go to their bottom-up circuitry at all, and they'll continue talking about college, making their top-down thinking win over their bottom-up thinking. So generally speaking, our bottom-up thinking is determined by our attachment of sensory stimuli, and our top-down thinking is determined by our emotional state. And oftentimes what will happen is there will be a war or struggle between our top-down thinking and our bottom-up thinking, where we'll try to do something and our mind keeps getting distracted by senses. So we have sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, and normally our attention goes into these 5 senses. And we may see an ad for a video game, so my sight triggers my mind and my attention leaves my mind and goes to whatever I'm looking at, and my mind is occupied externally now. Now remember that bottom-up thinking isn't necessarily all evil, because if we think about daydreaming, fantasizing, or getting lost in our thoughts, that's the situation where our top-down thinking is actually dominating our attention, and our bottom-up thinking is almost completely out of the picture. And if we go back to why do people engage in self-injurious behaviors and things like that, these people are in a situation where they don't like the top-down thinking that their mind is doing based on how they feel. And they've basically figured out that there's certain things they can do to overload their bottom-up thinking with extreme sensory stimuli to force their attention away from their top-down thinking. In fact, majority of mental health issues like depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and so on, come from people who have their attention on a top-down thinking mind that causes them suffering. So bottom-up thinking is largely responsible for what keeps us grounded in reality and definitely has its place in the world. Another interesting thing about attention with sense organs is that if you shut off one sense organ, your attention towards the other 4 sense organs gets enhanced. And people who listen to music know this really well because when they close their eyes and listen, their capacity to listen to music actually increases. So if you knock out sight, the other 4 senses get enhanced, and if you knock out taste and hearing, the other 2 active senses get buffed. And remember that if your attention is on your top-down thinking, so you get lost in your mind, for example, all of the sense organs actually decrease. So you can almost think about your top-down thinking as another sense organ, which is why the system of yoga refers to top-down thinking as manindriya, or the sense of mind. Because when I'm daydreaming or occupied in my thoughts, my attention is actually in the sense of mind, and I'm not in any of the traditional 5 sense organs. And a lot of meditation techniques, especially grounding meditation techniques, use the traditional sense organs to pull you out of the sense of mind. So the next question becomes okay, all of this is cool, but literally how does Raja Yoga help you attain enlightenment? So we have our body, right, which sort of holds our mind in place. And then our mind is made up of 2 things, thoughts and emotions. So emotions are going to be happy, sad, love, anger, fear, surprise, lonely, things like that. And then we have thoughts, and within thoughts, there's top-down thinking, which is creative thinking, doing a task, brainstorming, daydreaming, fantasizing, and things like that. And then there's bottom-up thinking, which has to do with thoughts and are about sensory pulls around us. So sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And sometimes we get a sensory pull, so someone calls me an idiot, and that'll cause an emotional reaction of surprise and sadness, let's say. And then that in turn will affect my top-down thinking, right? I'll be why did he call me an idiot? Is because of something I said, and thoughts like that. And our emotions also affect our body, so I feel a tightness in my throat, and then my breath becomes fast and deep because I feel ashamed. And lastly, our attention is either going to be on our top-down thinking or our bottom-up thinking, because my attention is going to fight between my top-down thinking and my senses. So we'll go more into detail later on in the video, but this is the general gist of how we work as humans, right? So what does Raja Yoga do to us? So we start with the yamas and niyamas, which help us detach, so our attention moves slightly away from all of this. And then we do asana, which is all about the body, so that's taken care of. And then pranayam turns off our emotions, so that's out of the window too. And then pratyahara cancels out all of the sense organs, so I'm closing my eyes, there's no sound in the background, I can't smell anything, I'm not eating anything, so no taste. And then my body's sort of acclimatized to the feeling of the floor through homeostasis. So bottom of thinking is out the window. And lastly, I get lucky by doing asana, pranayama, and pratyahara because I'm not thinking about anything now. So my top-down thinking is also sort of goes out the window and goes away. So then the question becomes, what is this attention with no direction? So this is what Shiva, or Brahman, or cosmic consciousness looks like. Pure attention, or consciousness, with no direction. which is samadhi or temporary enlightenment. And prolonged periods of temporary enlightenment lead to moksha or permanent enlightenment or freedom. So we'll talk more about Pratyahara and Raja Yoga later on in the video, as well as the idea of community, intrusive thoughts, and thoughts as a whole. But understand that Pratyahara is literally the act of controlling and restraining your sense organs. So these 4 paths, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Raja Yoga, are oftentimes what people consider to be the only ways to attain enlightenment or happiness in life. But there's actually a lot more ways to become enlightened that have sort of cropped up over the years throughout the progression of humanity. Hatha Yoga means forceful enlightenment, and Hatha Yoga is really primarily focused all on asana and pranayama. So Hatha Yogis believe that unlike Raja Yogis, you don't actually have to do any of that other stuff, so like personal and societal observances, restraining your sense organs, or even meditate. And you can literally purify your body and mind so much simply by perfecting your body postures and breathing. And you can attain enlightenment literally by doing yoga postures and breath control practices. And most yoga studios and yoga classes around the world right now are actually Hatha Yoga classes. So when you hear the word yoga, usually what people are referring to is Hatha Yoga. Next up is Kriya Yoga. Kriya means verb, so Kriya Yoga is enlightenment by doing. And Kriya Yoga is also more of a recent invention, where some of these more modern day yogic teachers looked at like all of these traditions, studied a lot of these different techniques, and distilled them into an essence of a few key practices. And the goal of Kriya Yoga is to systematically purify your consciousness and mind. So whereas Hatha Yoga is focused on the body and draws from like a bunch of historic traditions simply to purify the body, Kriya Yoga is similar but draws on from like a bunch of different traditions simply to purify like the mind and consciousness. So Kriya Yoga practices are sort of mind and consciousness focused, and Kriya Yoga also has some of the more advanced hybrid meditation techniques that people do to attain like very specific and customized goals. So we'll share one Kriya Yoga meditation that has to do with sort of like fantasizing at the end of the video. But Kriya Yoga is basically a distillation of every single practice of yoga into an essence of a handful of practices. So the last 3 methods of yoga all have to do with the pranamaya kosha, which is the life energy layer of a human being. And just a quick reminder that even though there sadly isn't any scientific evidence yet that prana or chi is real, or that the pranamaya kosha even exists, there have been a lot of clinical studies that show how doing pranamaya kosha related activities do seem to work in the way that the yogis claimed, despite how our resolution of science is very low. First up is Kundalini Yoga. And Kundalini Yoga is really cool because it means enlightenment via Kundalini Shakti or Kundalini energy. And Kundalini is the closest form of enlightenment that's sort of a middle ground between creating internal change and external change. Because remember that yoga is all about creating internal change and enlightenment. Tantra is all about controlling mystical forces and esoteric forces to create external change out in the universe. And Kundalini is sort of a middle ground, where it can create internal change and external change. So remember that our pranamaya koshas are made up of 72,000 nadis, or 72,000 energy channels, and that these 72,000 nadis meet up at 114 energy centers or nexuses that they call chakras. Of these 114 chakras, 108 of them are active throughout our body, mostly situated on our spine, and these chakras govern different faculties within us. And by purifying these different chakras, you can sort of attain certain qualities or even fix certain parts of your body or mental functioning, and you can eventually purify these chakras to the point where you become enlightened, which is what Kundalini Yoga is all about. The Kundalini yogis really focused on 7 of these chakras, which we'll go over in a bit, and Kundalini Yoga is really cool because some people want to meditate with some sort of like a specific goal in mind, and Kundalini Yoga shows how certain kinds of practices have certain kinds of like specific benefits. So we have 7 chakras, which include the Muladhara chakra, or the root chakra, Svadhisthana chakra, or sacral chakra, Manipuraka chakra, or navel chakra, Anahata chakra, or heart chakra, Vishuddha chakra, or throat chakra, Agnya chakra, or third eye chakra, and Sahasrara chakra, or crown chakra. Each of these chakras have their own specific meditation practices tailored towards cleansing it, some of which include repeating certain sounds to generate a particular vibration, imagining certain colors, and realizing some primordial elements. But let's start with the Muladhara chakra. The Muladhara chakra is situated at the base of our spine, and the Muladhara governs sensory impulses. So the Kundalini yogis believe that when your prana is floating around the Muladhara chakra, so like what that means is like the nerves come out from the tailbone crossing each other, and if they become too tight, energy can't flow and you have like these primal instincts kind of take over. So like people with food addictions or people that are very lustful and kind of operating on their animalistic desires and struggle with controlling their basic impulses often find benefit from practices around the Muladhara chakra. And things like bottom up thinking also come from the Muladhara chakra. So when the nerves loosen up, then the prana continues to flow. And the Muladhara chakra effectively becomes cleansed, and there's like 4 major arteries that cross from the tailbone, which sometimes get symbolized as 4 petals, where when the blood or prana flows through all 4 of these arteries, it supposedly makes the sound lam. And so literally if you keep making the sound lam, lam, lam over and over and over again, the idea is that it actually kind of imitates the sound of the Muladhara chakra's nerves, and it will start to loosen up a bit, giving you control over your primal impulses again. And this concept of sounds creating vibrations in our body to open your chakras is called Bij mantras. So the Muladhara chakra's color is red and element is earth. And not only is it concerned with worldly basal desires, but it's also concerned with safety, security, and worldly involvement. So managing your sensory stimuli is another way to sort of cleanse the Muladhara chakra. Above the Muladhara chakra is the Swadhisthana chakra, which is situated near your pubic bone or sacrum, so like near your tailbone. And the Swadhisthana chakra governs things like vitality, passion, experience, energy, love, and relationships, wanting to expand. And this is actually the chakra that holds all of the Kundalini energy. This chakra's color is orange and element is water. And an imbalance in the Swadhisthana chakra causes things like aimlessness, loss of passion and compassion, and even problems in like relationships and loneliness. And cleansing this chakra is said to improve passion and sort of the overall experience of life. So to cleanse this chakra, the Bij mantra is Vam. So like the sound you keep saying over and over again is like Vam, Vam, Vam. And you can also do things like exercising, watching sunsets, spending time with yourself and things like that. So like away from distractions and turning off technology and stuff. And that's also said to cleanse the Swadhisthana chakra. Next up is the Manipuraka chakra, which is referred to as the navel chakra or solar plexus chakra. And the Manipura chakra is located like literally right above our navel and is what governs our Agni. So the Kundalini yogis realize that we have certain things that are not us that can then become a part of us. And they call this faculty of metabolism the Agni force or the digestive fire. So if I eat a burger, that bun, lettuce, cheese, and meat will become things like cells, skin, and blood. Right? There's something in our body that takes things that are not us and turns them into us. The other thing that Agni does is digest information and turns it into understanding, and is also what burns up and digests things like negative emotions and sort of negative memories. So there's a lot of clinical evidence that teaching patients who want to like let go of their regrets or digest their negative feelings with emotional processing Manipura practices seems to have a clinically beneficial impact, despite the science being kind of lackluster for now. So the interesting thing is that our ego, ahamkara, sense of identity or I feeling, is also governed by the Manipura chakra, and when this chakra goes out of balance, not only will that make us sort of worse at like digesting information into understanding or digesting our negative emotions, but it also makes us more egotistical and egocentric. So the Manipura's element is fire, the color is yellow, the Bij mantra is Ram, and the way you balance the Manipuraka chakra is by doing yoga asanas and also sort of noticing your ego whenever it activates, trying your best to control it. Next up is the Anahata chakra or heart chakra. The Anahata chakra's color is green, the element is air, and the Bij mantra is Yam. So the Anahata chakra is where our faculty of compassion and empathy comes from, right? So a lot of people will like beat themselves up with like low self-esteem and like negative self-talk, or will be like angry towards other people. And if you want to learn how to forgive, talk to yourself in a kind way, compassion and forgiveness, or like strengthen your empathy, then Anahata chakra practices are the practices you'll want to do. So when the Anahata chakra gets completely balanced or cleansed, then nothing happening can actually hurt you emotionally. And the interesting thing is that the Anahata chakra is set to hold the emotional state of your current life and your past life, where all memories and impressions from all your lives are supposedly stored in the Anahata chakra. One way to cleanse this chakra is by physically turning your dominant hand into like a heart-like fist, and your other hand sort of like flat, and using your flat hand to kind of orbit your fist in a clockwise sort of pattern around your rib cage. And this mini exercise is said to really unblock and cleanse your Anahata chakra. Above the Anahata chakra is the Vishuddha chakra or the throat chakra, where the element for this chakra is ether. The color is like teal or light blue, and the Bij mantra is Hum. So the Kundalini yogis sort of conceptualize that the throat is kind of the way that we affect the outside world. So Vishuddha chakra practices are all about affecting change on the outside, right? So all the previous chakras were kind of internal stuff, but the Vishuddha chakra is where we sort of transition to the outside world, and the yogis realize that if we want to make a change in the outside world, the voice is going to be the most powerful tool we have to do that. So if you're looking for a particular kind of external goal, like a promotion, or to convince people of things, then the yogis would recommend you do Vishuddha chakra practices. An imbalance in the throat chakra causes bad communication, alexithymia, or an inability to say how you feel. We'll talk more about this later on in the video. And a large degree of hesitance to speak in front of masses of people, where you feel kind of incompetent when communicating. So there's kind of a spectrum with the Vishuddha chakra state, where if it's unbalanced on the low end of the spectrum, then we're hurting ourselves by not being able to communicate properly. And if it's unbalanced on the high end of the spectrum, then you're kind of talking all the time and acting a little aggressively even. So there's a sweet spot range in the middle, where your voice induces ease and pleasance within yourself and others. So the way to balance this chakra is actually to go mute however much you want, and keeping your words to yourself, and more importantly, notice what you want to talk and when you want to talk and why you want to talk. The sixth chakra is the Agnya chakra, or third eye chakra, and is located right above our eyebrow center. The color is dark blue, and the Bij mantra is Om. So you say Om, Om, Om. So the word Agnya means command. And the Agnya chakra is our source of intuition or understanding. It's not really digesting external information, but it's our default kind of intuition. And similar to how our bottom-up thinking comes from our Muladhara chakra, our top-down thinking comes from our Agnya chakra. So if you're interested in understanding other people, things in the outside world, how you work, or even how the universe works and things like that, then the Agnya chakra is what you want to focus on. An unbalanced Agnya chakra leads to things like unhealthy and excessive daydreaming and fantasizing on one end of the spectrum, and a poor intuition on the other end of the spectrum. So the last chakra is the Sahasrara chakra, and this is where things get kind of weird. So the color is purple, and the Bij mantra is Ring, and the crown chakra is basically the area from where our spine meets our skull to the top back sort of bump on our head, and so all of that is the Sahasrara chakra. In the very middle of the Sahasrara chakra is something called the Bindu Visarga. So in the theory of Kundalini Yoga, when this Kundalini energy that you have, which normally starts out at the base of your spine, travels up to the final seventh chakra at the top, this is when you gain enlightenment. So there aren't really any discrete practices for the Sahasrara chakra, but it's sort of the final step that's amorphous and almost like Maslow's hierarchy style. And when all of your other chakras align, if you're lucky, it'll rise all the way to the top and then you'll become enlightened. Remember that the mind puts you in the past or future and never lets you live in the present. And when you're enlightened, thoughts cease because thoughts are all about the past or future. So when the Kundalini Shakti rises, your thought process stops, or when your thought process stops, your Kundalini Shakti rises, so it's sort of a two-way sort of cycle. Now, even though there aren't really meditation exercises for this Sahasrara chakra, one sort of exercise you can do to start to tingle the Sahasrara chakra a little, if you do it correctly, which is a really hard exercise, by the way, is whenever you literally do anything, try to feel the person who's experiencing, and acknowledge instead of understand. So that's the 7 chakras. Remember that even though this theory of chakras may sound kind of cool and all, there isn't actually good concrete evidence that this chakra stuff and the Pranamaya Kosha actually exists. But with clinical studies, what the prevailing theory states is that the yogis sort of figured out that each of these dimensions or chakras, so whether it's basal impulses or compassion or intuition, all involve different parts of our brain. And we know that different meditation techniques do affect different areas in the brain. And so the yogis basically stumbled upon particular practices that cultivate particular parts of the brain. So for example, Anahat chakra practices may affect our default mode network really well, which is a part of our brain that can kind of blame us and beat us up. And the Agnya chakra practices may affect some of our cerebral cortices, which help us intuitively understand things. So even though it is possible to map out the different effects of chakra meditations onto our physiology, we simply don't have enough scientific research to be able to comfortably do so yet. So the first of the 3 forms of yoga that have to do with the Pranamaya Kosha we're covering in this video is Kundalini Yoga, and the second type of yoga is Svara Yoga, or enlightenment via nostrils. The word Svara in Sanskrit means sound or musical note, but it also means the continuous flow of air through nostrils. So Svara Yoga is all about realizing the connection between breathing through your nose and its relation to like phases of the moon, time of day, direction, position of celestial objects like the sun, moon, and planets, and even physical and mental conditions of an individual, and then taking the appropriate action according to these subtle relations. A good example of this is that during sunrise and sunset, if you pay attention to your nostrils, neither of them will actually be clogged and they'll both be kind of free and open unless you're literally sick. Another example is if your right nostril is clogged and your left nostril is free, you're more likely to feel kind of calm, cooler, and like a little bit recharged, maybe a little bit sluggish. Whereas if your left nostril is clogged and your right nostril is open, then you're more likely to feel energized, restless, jumpy, and maybe even have like an overactive mind. Your nostrils actually alternate in which one is clogged at any given time throughout the day, which could actually correlate to your mood or emotional state. So this was a really basic sort of introduction to Svara Yoga, and Svara Yogis will attempt to teach this science for like years and still be left with more to say. So there's a lot more about Svara Yoga if you're interested in things like astrology, predictions, mood alterations, and things like that. The third form of yoga that has to do with the Pranamaya Kosha, and the last form of yoga we'll mention in this video, is Nada Yoga, or enlightenment via music. So thousands of years ago, the yogis believed that the entire universe is a vibration or oscillation of energy and matter, and that the entire universe is actually sound because wherever there's vibration, humans also hear that as sound. And if you look at music, it's essentially an arrangement of a bunch of these sounds. Furthermore, if you look at all of our experiences of life, whether it's light, sound, or mood, they're all happening within us and never outside of ourselves. Remember that the Pranamaya Kosha of the human body has 72,000 nadis and meet and distribute at 108 active energy junction boxes or chakras. These 108 chakras are divided in the right and the left as Ida and Pingala, making 54 chakras each. And based on this system, the yogis came up with the Sanskrit alphabet of 54 sounds that each correspond with the chakra. And each of the 54 letters has a masculine and feminine version, with a total of 108 manifestation of letters, and it turns out that classical Indian music evolved out of these 108 sounds. So Indian classical music is all about touching and activating these 108 chakras in our body, which leads to a higher level of consciousness, along with being a form of entertainment. So Nada Yoga is the process of using these 108 sounds to evolve a human being into a universal identity, making them become enlightened. So if someone listens to the right music with the proper involvement, it creates pleasantness in the body, mind, and spirit to the point of moksha or freedom. So remember that the goal of understanding this historical take on meditation, as well as all the different types of like yoga and stuff, is really to help lay out all the options. Because different meditation techniques work for different people, and the best meditation experiences involve picking the style of meditation that works best for you. So really ask yourself, which of these paths kind of appeals to me? Do you want something that's a little bit more devotional or maybe have a religious temperament by nature? Then maybe check out Bhakti Yogi. If you're someone who really wants to like make a change in the world, make the world sort of a better place through like activism and good deeds and things like that, then try out Karma Yoga. If you're really contemplative in nature and really enjoy kind of reflecting, thinking, and understanding life, maybe you'll find Jnana Yoga interesting. Maybe you're someone who needs like a stepwise process that's highly organized and divided into pieces to attain enlightenment, then like go ahead and practice Raja Yoga. And then there's even the more specific stuff. So if you're like someone who has a really discrete and specific goal in mind when they want to meditate, so maybe you want to like control your impulses or like improve your intuition or things like that, then maybe Kundalini Yoga has something you'll like. Are you someone who wants a more customized and distilled approach to enlightenment? Then try looking into Kriya Yoga. Maybe you're a little bit more physical in nature and you enjoy like yoga postures and breathing exercises and things like that. So then maybe Hatha Yoga could be perfect for you. Are you interested in learning about like celestial beings and like understanding how everything in the universe works simply from the feeling of air flowing through your nostrils? Then you'll really enjoy Svara Yoga. Maybe you're a little bit more musical in nature and enjoy like sounds and audio production and stuff like that. Then maybe you'll really like Nada Yoga. Maybe you'll really enjoy one of the paths of Buddhism, so by all means, like go for one of them. And lastly, are you someone who wants to like cultivate these weird esoteric mystical forces to bend the universe to your will and don't really care about the science? Then Tantra is perfect for you. So the goal is really to give you an introductory overview of like what all the options are.